I'm Celeste, 62 years old, a retired nurse living in my small cabin in Vermont. My son Thomas and I were once inseparable, sharing holidays and life's precious moments together, until that fateful Christmas Eve. Bitter snowflakes fell around me as I stood outside his mansion, knocking on a door no one would open, while laughter echoed from inside. The betrayal froze deeper than the winter cold. That night, I drove home and made a decision that would change everything. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and stay with me to discover how a mother's love can transform into quiet strength. My journey as a mother began, and nearly ended, in the same hospital. I worked as a nurse there for 35 years, and it was in that same maternity ward where I gave birth to my only child, Thomas. His father, Robert, was my high school sweetheart, the kind of love story people used to write about. We built our life together brick by brick, saving for years to afford our modest house in the Vermont countryside. Robert never got to see Thomas graduate high school. The heart attack came suddenly one October morning while he was raking leaves in our yard. Thomas was just 17 then, and overnight our family of 3 became 2. The loss transformed my son in ways I didn't fully understand until years later. He became more determined, more driven to succeed, as if trying to live up to the father he had lost too soon. I threw myself into being both parents for Thomas. Working double shifts at the hospital, I would come home exhausted, but still find time to help with college applications and attend every school event. My colleagues often asked how I managed, but what choice did a mother have? Thomas was brilliant, earning a scholarship to study architecture at a prestigious university, but it only covered part of the tuition. The decision to sell our family home wasn't easy, but watching Thomas walk across the stage at his college graduation made every sacrifice worthwhile. I downsized to a small cabin on the outskirts of town, using the difference to help Thomas start his life debt-free. The cabin wasn't much, but it had a view of the mountains that brought me peace on lonely evenings. Those early years after college, Thomas and I remained close. Sunday mornings were sacred to us both. He would drive over early, and we would make pancakes from scratch, using Robert's old recipe. While the batter sizzled on the griddle, we would talk about his projects at the architecture firm where he had started working. Sometimes we would take long walks in the nearby woods, identifying birds and collecting interesting stones, just as we had done when he was a child. Thomas kept his promise to visit regularly for the first few years. On my birthday, he would show up with wildflowers and take me to dinner at the only fancy restaurant in town. He would tell me stories about his co-workers and the buildings he was helping to design. I kept a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings whenever his name was mentioned for a local project, my pride evident in the careful way each article was preserved. The winter Thomas turned 30, he called with excitement in his voice that I hadn't heard since he was a boy on Christmas morning. He had met someone at a client meeting, an interior designer named Amanda. The way he described her, I knew before he did that this was serious. Thomas had dated casually before, but never had a woman's name peppered every conversation we had. I first met Amanda at a Sunday pancake breakfast Thomas insisted on hosting at his new apartment in the city. She was striking with her perfectly styled hair and designer clothes that made my hand-knitted sweater feel suddenly shabby. Still, she greeted me warmly, complimenting the maple syrup I had brought from a local farm. She asked thoughtful questions about my nursing career and seemed genuinely interested in the photo album of Thomas's childhood I had brought along. The wedding came quickly, barely 8 months after they met. Amanda's parents paid for most of it, an elaborate affair at a country club with hundreds of guests, most of whom I had never met. I wore a new blue dress I had saved 3 months to afford and gave a toast with shaking hands about the beautiful man my son had become. If I noticed Amanda's slight frown when I mentioned some of Thomas's awkward teenage moments, I dismissed it as wedding day nerves. The first year of their marriage, I was still included in their lives regularly. Amanda would call occasionally to ask for recipes or advice about maintaining the garden in their new home. Thomas and I still had our Sunday phone calls, though the pancake breakfast became less frequent as his career demands grew. When they announced they were expecting their first child, I cried tears of joy and immediately started knitting baby blankets. Emma was born in the spring, a beautiful baby girl with Thomas's eyes. I took a week off from work to help the new parents cooking meals and doing laundry, while Amanda recovered from the delivery. It was during this visit that I noticed the first cracks in our relationship. Amanda became increasingly particular about how things should be done in their home. My suggestions about baby care were met with polite but firm references to parenting books she had read. When I left, Thomas hugged me tightly, but seemed relieved to see me go. Jack arrived 2 years later, and by then the invitations to visit had become formally scheduled and less frequent. When I did see the children, it was often at carefully orchestrated events where Amanda's parents took center stage as the doting grandparents. I tried to forge my own relationship with Emma and Jack, bringing thoughtfully chosen gifts and trying to create traditions like I had with Thomas. Emma warmed to me, especially when I taught her to identify constellations during summer evening visits. Jack was always more reserved, watching me with curious eyes that reminded me so much of his father at that age. As the years passed, the distance between Thomas and me grew in ways that couldn't be measured in miles. Phone calls that once lasted hours became brief exchanges of family updates. The intimate details of his life, his dreams and fears, were no longer shared with me. When I retired from nursing at 60, Thomas sent flowers but couldn't attend the small party my coworkers threw. Amanda had planned a family trip to Disney World that same weekend. I tried to maintain our connection through small gestures: birthday cards with personal notes, Christmas packages wrapped with care, offers to babysit the children that were politely declined. I never spoke ill of Amanda, even when friends suggested she was deliberately coming between us. Thomas had made his choice of partner, and I respected that, even as I mourned the closeness we once had. My fixed income meant careful budgeting, but I always set aside money throughout the year for special gifts for Emma and Jack. One year, I found a collection of architectural magazines from the year Thomas was born at an estate sale. Another time, I spent months searching for a rare first edition of a book by an architect Thomas had admired in college. The children received equally thoughtful presents, chosen to reflect their growing personalities and interests, as I learned about them through Thomas's increasingly infrequent updates. Despite the growing distance, I kept Thomas as beneficiary on my life insurance policy, maintained a college fund for each of the grandchildren, and even helped with a down payment on a vacation property Thomas had mentioned wanting. These financial decisions were made quietly, without expectation of gratitude or recognition. They were simply the actions of a mother who wanted security for her child and his family, even if our emotional connection had frayed. Each year, I would send a Christmas invitation offering to host the family in my small cabin. Each year, Thomas would decline with various excuses, usually related to Amanda's preference for spending holidays with her larger family network. I decorated my cabin anyway, hanging the ornaments Thomas had made as a child, and setting places at my table just in case plans changed. They never did. Until last year, when everything changed. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, so unexpected that I nearly let it go to voicemail as I struggled to remove my snow boots at the door. When I saw Thomas's name on the caller ID, I fumbled to answer, nearly dropping the phone in my haste. "Mom," he said, his voice formal, in a way that made my heart sink. "We were wondering if you'd like to join us for Christmas Eve this year." The invitation hung in the air like the icicles outside my window. Beautiful, but somehow dangerous. 3 years had passed since I had last been invited to their home for a holiday. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed the phone closer to my ear. "Amanda's parents are traveling to Europe this year," he continued when I didn't immediately respond. "So we thought it might be nice to have you over. Emma and Jack have been asking about you." Had they really? The thought that my grandchildren remembered me enough to ask warmed a cold corner of my heart. I tried to keep the desperate hope out of my voice as I accepted, already mentally rearranging my modest Christmas budget to accommodate proper gifts for the occasion. "That would be lovely, Thomas. Thank you for thinking of me." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, looking out at the snow-covered pines behind my cabin, and allowed myself to imagine a reconciliation. Perhaps this invitation was Thomas's way of bridging the gap that had grown between us. Perhaps Amanda had finally become secure enough in her role to welcome me into their family circle. Perhaps my grandchildren would have the chance to know their grandmother after all. The next day, I withdrew money from my emergency savings and drove to the nearest shopping mall an hour away. The crowds of Christmas shoppers were overwhelming after my quiet life, but I navigated them with determination. For Emma, now 12, I had been working on a quilt for months, incorporating fabrics that told a story of our family history, including a square made from one of her father's baby blankets. But I wanted to add something a teenage girl would appreciate immediately, so I selected a delicate silver bracelet with a star charm, remembering our nights studying constellations. For 10-year-old Jack, I had researched extensively. Thomas had mentioned in a recent call that Jack was showing interest in engineering a detail I had carefully filed away. At a specialty store, I found a complex model train set with tracks that could be configured in multiple designs, combining creativity with technical skill. It was far more than I should have spent, but the thought of Jack's face lighting up made the credit card debt worth it. Thomas's gift had required months of planning. Through an old nursing colleague whose husband collected rare books, I had located a set of vintage architectural books from the 1920s, featuring buildings that had inspired Thomas during his studies. They had cost 3 months of my electricity budget, but I had adjusted by keeping the cabin cooler and using candles in the evenings. For Amanda, I chose a cookbook featuring international cuisine, remembering how she had once mentioned wanting to expand her culinary skills beyond the basics. I added a handwritten card with some of my own family recipes that Thomas had loved as a child, an olive branch of sorts, sharing something that connected us both to the man we loved. The week before Christmas, I transformed my kitchen into a baking workshop. The familiar rhythms of measuring flour and creaming butter were therapeutic as I prepared Thomas's favorite cookies, gingerbread men with personality. He had loved them as a child, insisting on naming each cookie before eating it. I wondered if he had continued this tradition with his own children, or if it had been lost in the transition to his new family. I also baked pumpkin bread cranberry muffins and a special rum cake that had been Robert's favorite. The cabin filled with nostalgic scents that brought tears to my eyes more than once. I packaged everything carefully in tins, decorated with ribbon, imagining these homemade treats becoming part of their Christmas breakfast tradition. The night before Christmas Eve, I barely slept. Instead, I sat by my small Christmas tree, carefully wrapping each gift with paper I had selected to match the recipient's personality. For Emma, paper with silver stars against a deep blue background. For Jack, a pattern of vintage trains in primary colors. Thomas's books were wrapped in elegant navy blue with a real satin ribbon. Amanda's cookbook received tasteful silver paper with an embossed pattern. I had also knitted new stockings for each family member with their names embroidered in careful stitches. It had taken months of working by lamplight, my arthritic fingers sometimes protesting, but the result was worth the discomfort. 5 stockings, one for each of them, and one for me, a tangible symbol of my hope that we could be a complete family again. Christmas Eve dawned with heavy snow clouds and a wind that rattled the windows of my cabin. The weather report warned of difficult driving conditions, but nothing could have deterred me. I loaded my old car carefully, the back seat and trunk filled with gifts and food. The drive to Thomas's house normally took 45 minutes, but I allowed 3 hours given the weather and my caution on winter roads. 20 miles into the journey, my car began making an ominous knocking sound. I pulled over, my heart racing with anxiety. The snow was falling more heavily now, reducing visibility. After a few minutes of rest, I tried again, and the car moved forward though the knocking continued. I couldn't afford to be late or to miss this opportunity entirely. I pressed on, speaking soothingly to the vehicle, as if it could be encouraged by kindness to make the full journey. The pain in my hands intensified with the cold, despite my gloves, the arthritis that had ended my nursing career making its presence known. I flexed my fingers against the steering wheel, periodically trying to maintain circulation. The heater in the car worked intermittently, blowing cold air as often as warm. Still, these discomforts seemed minor obstacles compared to the prospect of seeing my son and grandchildren. As I drove, I allowed myself to imagine the evening ahead. Perhaps Emma would sit beside me asking questions about her father's childhood. Maybe Jack would want to hear stories about his grandfather, a man he had never known. Thomas might recognize the cookies from his youth and share the naming tradition with his children. Amanda might appreciate the family recipes, seeing them as a gift rather than an intrusion. In my mind, the evening ended with plans for regular visits, a new chapter in our family story. The reality began to intrude on these fantasies as I approached Thomas's neighborhood. Their home was in an exclusive development, large houses set back from the road on manicured lots. My old car, with its rusting fender and mismatched door, looked conspicuously out of place as I pulled into their circular driveway, taking care not to block any of the other vehicles already parked there. I hadn't expected additional guests, and a flutter of anxiety disturbed my carefully maintained optimism. Carrying the first load of packages to the door required 2 trips from the car. Snow continued to fall, dusting my coat and hair as I balanced boxes in arms that weren't as strong as they once had been. By the time I rang the doorbell, my glasses were fogged from exertion and I was already exhausted. But I fixed a smile on my face, determined to make this reunion everything I had dreamed it would be. The door swung open, releasing a wave of warm air scented with cinnamon and pine. Amanda stood framed in the doorway, looking festive in a red sweater that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly when she saw me, the warmth never quite reaching her eyes. "Celeste, you made it despite the weather. Come in before you freeze." She stepped back, allowing me to enter, but not offering to help with the packages I carried. The entryway opened into a great room decorated for Christmas. With professional flair, a 12-foot tree adorned with coordinating ornaments dominated the space. Music played softly, and the sound of laughter came from another room. I stood awkwardly, snow melting from my boots onto their imported tile floor. "Thomas is in the family room with the other guests. You can put your things anywhere for now." Amanda gestured vaguely before turning away. "I need to check on something in the kitchen." I carefully placed my packages near the tree, noticing they looked homemade and humble compared to the sleek, store-wrapped gifts already there. Removing my snow-covered coat, I hung it in the closet Amanda had pointed out, taking a moment to smooth my hair and straighten the holiday sweater I had carefully selected for the occasion. The family room buzzed with conversation when I entered. At least a dozen people sat in clusters, wine glasses in hand. I scanned the room for Thomas, finally spotting him near the fireplace, deep in conversation with a man I didn't recognize. He glanced up, noticed me, and raised his hand in a half-wave before returning to his discussion. No hug, no immediate welcome, just that distracted acknowledgement. I made my way toward him anyway, navigating around elegant furniture and people who looked at me with curiosity, but no recognition. When I finally reached my son, he turned with a smile that seemed practiced rather than spontaneous. "Mom, glad you could make it. The roads must be terrible." "Nothing would have kept me away," I replied, hoping my voice didn't reveal the hurt his casual greeting had caused. "The car made some concerning noises on the way, but we made it." "You should have that checked," he said, then gestured to the man beside him. "This is Dennis Walker, my new project partner. Dennis, my mother Celeste." Dennis offered a polite handshake and immediately steered the conversation back to whatever business matter they had been discussing. Thomas made no move to introduce me to anyone else or to include me in their conversation. After a few minutes of standing silently beside them, I excused myself to look for my grandchildren. I found Emma sitting with 2 other girls in a window seat, all 3 focused on their phones, occasionally showing each other their screens and giggling. At 14, she had grown taller since I'd last seen her, more adult in her appearance, with subtle makeup enhancing her features. I approached cautiously, not wanting to embarrass her in front of her friends. "Emma, it's Grandma Celeste." She looked up, surprise flickering across her face before she composed herself. "Oh, hi. I didn't know you were coming." Her tone suggested that no one had mentioned my invitation to her, contradicting Thomas's claim that the children had been asking about me. "Your father invited me for Christmas Eve. It's wonderful to see you," I said, resisting the urge to hug her. "You've grown so much." Emma nodded, glancing at her friends who were watching our interaction with undisguised curiosity. "Yeah, I guess. We're kind of in the middle of something right now. The dismissal was clear, but I tried once more. I brought you a gift I think you'll like. Maybe later we can catch up a bit. Sure, whatever, she mumbled, already looking back at her phone. I retreated, searching the room for Jack. He was nowhere to be seen, possibly playing in another part of the house. Instead, I headed for the kitchen, thinking I could offer Amanda help with dinner preparations. The kitchen was a showcase of gleaming stainless steel and marble countertops. Amanda worked alongside an older woman I didn't recognize, both of them moving with the synchronized efficiency of people accustomed to cooking together. "Can I help with anything?" I offered, hovering in the doorway. Amanda looked up, her expression suggesting my presence was an interruption rather than a welcome addition. "Oh, we have it under control, thanks. This is my Aunt Sophia. She's staying with us for the holidays." The aunt barely glanced at me, continuing to stir something on the professional-grade stovetop. I noticed my food contributions sitting unopened on a counter pushed to the side to make room for their preparations. "I brought some of Thomas's favorite cookies and Robert's rum cake," I said, moving toward the packages. "Should I put them out with the other desserts?" "We have a specific menu planned," Amanda replied, her tone making it clear my offerings didn't fit into her vision for the evening. "But thank you for bringing them. Maybe the children can enjoy them tomorrow." Effectively dismissed again, I wandered back to the great room, feeling increasingly out of place in this house that contained my son, but felt nothing like a home where I belonged. I finally spotted Jack sitting on the floor near the Christmas tree, playing a video game on a tablet, his face intent on the screen. I sat down beside him, careful not to block his view. "Hello, Jack. Do you remember your Grandma Celeste?" He looked up briefly, his expression neutral. "Sort of. You sent me that fossil kit last year." My heart lifted slightly. "Yes, that's right. Did you enjoy it?" "It was okay. Mom said it was too messy for the house, though." Before I could respond, a bell chimed somewhere, and Amanda appeared to announce dinner was ready. Jack jumped up and ran toward the dining room without another word to me. I followed more slowly, already dreading the next awkward social hurdle. The dining room featured a table that could easily seat 20, already set with fine china and crystal. Name cards marked each place, and I scanned them looking for mine. When I couldn't find it, I approached Amanda, who was directing guests to their seats. "Amanda, I don't see my place card," I said quietly. She glanced around with a frown, as if just realizing the oversight. "Oh, we had a last-minute addition. We've set up a small table in the breakfast nook for the children's table. You won't mind sitting with them, will you? It's just through there." The breakfast nook turned out to be a small space off the kitchen, clearly separated from the main dining area. A folding table had been hastily set up with mismatched dishes and paper napkins, instead of the cloth ones in the dining room. Emma and Jack weren't there, having apparently been deemed old enough to sit at the adult table. Instead, 3 children I didn't know, all under the age of 7, were being settled in by a teenage girl who appeared to be babysitting. "You must be Thomas's mom," the teenager said. "I'm Lily, Amanda's cousin. I'm watching the little ones so their parents can enjoy dinner." I nodded, taking a seat at the small table where my knees barely fit underneath. From this position, I couldn't see or hear anything happening in the main dining room. Dinner was served to us last, the plates already prepared, rather than allowing us to select our own portions from the serving dishes I could glimpse being passed around the main table. As I picked at my cooling food, I overheard one of the parents coming in to check on their child say to Lily, "Amanda said she had to invite her, but she didn't say anything about having to entertain her. The things we do out of obligation during the holidays, right?" The comment stung, confirming what I had suspected since arriving. My invitation hadn't been motivated by a desire to reconnect, but by some sense of duty or obligation that Thomas and Amanda felt they needed to fulfill. I was a box to be checked off their Christmas list, not a welcome addition to their celebration. After dinner, everyone gathered in the family room again. I tried to find a place to sit, but all the comfortable seating was quickly claimed. I ended up perched on a hard decorative bench near the hallway, watching as gifts were distributed to all the children, except mine, for Emma and Jack. Amanda's explanation was that they were saving family gifts for Christmas morning. I noticed I had left my purse in the car and realized I should retrieve it as it contained medication I needed to take with dinner. Slipping on my coat, I stepped outside into the still falling snow. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the bitter cold took my breath away. I hurried to my car, grabbed my purse, and turned back toward the house. The door had swung shut behind me. I tried the handle, but it had locked automatically. I knocked lightly at first, then with more force, when no one immediately answered. Through a frosted window, I could see figures moving inside the party, continuing without interruption. I knocked again, my knuckles beginning to ache from the cold and the force of my efforts. A face appeared at the window next to the door. It was one of the guests, a woman I had been briefly introduced to earlier. She looked out at me, then turned and said something to someone inside. A moment later, another face joined hers, then another. They were looking at me standing in the snow, but no one moved to open the door. Then I saw Thomas. He approached the window, looked out at me, and for a brief moment our eyes met. I raised my hand in a small wave, certain he would hurry to let me in. Instead, he smiled in a way I didn't recognize, said something to the others that caused laughter, and turned away, disappearing back into the warmth of the gathering. I stood there, snow collecting on my shoulders and hair, unable to process what was happening. Surely it was a misunderstanding. Someone would notice my absence and come looking for me. But minutes passed, and the door remained closed. Through the window I could see the party continuing, drinks being refreshed, conversation flowing as if no one had noticed or cared that I was locked outside in freezing temperatures. After what must have been 30 minutes, my fingers and toes numb, despite my winter gear, reality set in, with a clarity that cut deeper than the cold. This was not an oversight. This was deliberate. The laughter I had glimpsed when Thomas looked out at me confirmed what my heart had been trying to deny all evening. I was not welcome here. I was perhaps even a source of amusement. With dignity that cost everything I had, I brushed the snow from my coat, returned to my car, and started the engine. The knocking sound seemed louder now, but I barely registered it. I backed carefully out of the driveway, leaving behind the gifts I had so carefully selected, the food I had lovingly prepared, and the last illusions I had about my place in my son's life. As I drove away from the house, ablaze with light and laughter, tears froze on my cheeks in the unheated car. The snow fell heavier now, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead. But I drove steadily, focused on the single goal of returning to my cabin, the only true home I had left. The drive home passed in a blur of swirling snow and numbing heartache. My old car protested with increasingly alarming sounds, but it carried me faithfully through the storm, perhaps sensing my desperate need for sanctuary. The roads were nearly deserted, most people already settled in their homes for Christmas Eve, surrounded by love and acceptance I no longer had. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a determination born of survival rather than hope. Each mile took me further from the beautiful house where I had been rejected, and closer to the modest cabin that had never felt more like a refuge. Thoughts tumbled through my mind like the snowflakes against my windshield, impossible to grasp or organize. The image of Thomas turning away from the window haunted me, playing on repeat behind my eyes. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the motion-activated light flickered on, illuminating the simple wreath on my door, the only exterior decoration I had managed this year. Inside, my small tree glowed with the multicolored lights Thomas had always preferred as a child, though he now favored the coordinated white lights in his own home. The contrast between the warm welcome of my humble cabin and the cold rejection I had experienced in his mansion wasn't lost on me. I moved through my evening routine, mechanically hanging my wet coat, making tea. I didn't want turning up the thermostat to chase away the bone-deep chill. The physical cold from standing in the snow had penetrated deeper than my skin, settling somewhere in my soul. I sat in my rocking chair, hands wrapped around the steaming mug, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. My son, the baby I had nursed through fevers, the boy I had consoled through playground rejections, the teenager I had guided through grief after his father's death, the man whose dreams I had sacrificed to support, had looked at me through the glass and walked away. He had left me standing alone in the snow on Christmas Eve. Worse, he had shared the moment with others as something amusing rather than shameful. The question that kept circling in my mind was, where had I gone wrong? Had I been too giving, too sacrificing, allowing him to see my love as something to be exploited rather than treasured? Had I failed to teach him the basic human kindness that should extend to everyone, let alone one's mother? Or was this transformation entirely the result of external influences? Amanda's apparent disdain for me spreading to my son like a slow-acting poison. As midnight approached, marking the official arrival of Christmas Day, I found myself drawn to the boxes in my spare room where I kept family mementos. The physical effort of pulling them out provided temporary distraction from my emotional pain. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by fragments of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. There were Thomas's baby books carefully documented with his first words, first steps, first everything. School projects I had saved, including a Mother's Day card from 3rd grade, where he had written in wobbly handwriting, "I love you more than the whole sky." A collection of Father's Day cards he had made for Robert, which I had kept after my husband's death. High school awards, college acceptance letters, the program from his graduation, where he had been a featured student speaker. I found photo albums chronicling our life together. Thomas riding his first bike, his face a mixture of terror and triumph. Thomas and Robert building a treehouse in our old backyard. Thomas as a solemn-faced teenager at his father's funeral. Thomas in his cap and gown, arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming at the camera. The progression of images told the story of a deep and loving bond that seemed impossible to reconcile with the man who had abandoned me in the snow. Then I found a box of cards and letters Thomas had written to me over the years. Birthday cards with personal messages. Thank you notes for various gifts or support letters from college expressing homesickness and appreciation. I read them by the light of my Christmas tree, searching for clues about when and how things had changed. The most recent card was from 5 years ago, a birthday message that already showed signs of emotional distance. The personal note was brief and generic compared to earlier years. It was signed, "Love Thomas, Amanda, Emma, and Jack," though the children would have been too young to have had any input. After that, cards came from the family, store-bought with no personal message added, eventually dwindling to text messages or brief phone calls. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, I sat surrounded by the physical evidence of a relationship that had existed once but seemed to have vanished without my fully noticing its departure. The grief was overwhelming, but something else was beginning to emerge from beneath it. A quiet anger, not hot and destructive, but cool and clarifying. In the early morning light, with snow still falling outside my windows, I came to a realization that changed everything. I had spent years accepting less and less from Thomas, making excuses for his behavior, blaming outside influences, rather than holding him accountable. I had allowed my love for him to blind me to the reality that the relationship had become entirely one-sided. I had continued to give everything while he had given less and less, until finally he had taken even my basic dignity by leaving me out in the cold. And yet I was still providing financial support, still maintaining him as my beneficiary, still contributing to his children's future security. I had been treating him as the loving son he once was, not the man he had become. With this clarity came a decision. I would not continue to be a silent supporter of someone who could treat me with such callous disregard. Love without respect wasn't love at all, not even from a mother to her child. It was time to redirect my resources and emotional energy toward my own well-being. My phone remained silent all Christmas Day. No call from Thomas to apologize or even to check if I had made it home safely through the storm. No text from Amanda explaining the locked door. No message from my grandchildren thanking me for gifts they would never receive. The absence of communication confirmed that my decision was the right one. I spent the day creating an inventory of all the ways I had continued to support Thomas and his family, often without their knowledge. The list was longer than I had realized. Joint checking account established when Thomas was in college, into which I still deposited money monthly for emergencies. Life insurance policy with Thomas as sole beneficiary. College funds for Emma and Jack that I contributed to quarterly. Loan to Thomas for the down payment on their vacation property in Maine, which he had never repaid. ownership of 5 acres of undeveloped land adjacent to Thomas's home, which I had purchased as an investment for him, family heirlooms, including Robert's watch collection, and my grandmother's jewelry on permanent loan to Thomas and Amanda. Vintage furniture pieces in their home that had been mine, but which I had allowed them to use when they bought their house. Monthly contributions to their household landscaping service, a gift I had begun when they first moved in, intended to be temporary, but which had continued for years. Looking at the list, I was struck by how much I had continued to give without acknowledgement or gratitude. Each item represented a sacrifice on my part, money that could have improved my own living conditions or security. The cabin needed a new roof. My car was failing, and I carefully budgeted my medications to make them last longer. Yet I had never considered reducing these gifts to my son. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in years the decision made. In the morning, I would begin the process of reclaiming what was mine, not out of vengeance, but out of self-respect, and the recognition that my resources should support those who valued my presence in their lives, even if that was only myself. The week between Christmas and New Year's is typically a quiet period, but I filled mine with purposeful activity. The day after Christmas, I called a lawyer recommended by a former nursing colleague, explaining that I needed advice on financial and property matters. The earliest available appointment was December 27th, which gave me a day to organize my documents and clarify my intentions. The law office was in a converted Victorian house in the center of town, warm and welcoming, despite the serious nature of my visit. Janet Porter, the attorney, was a woman about my age with silver hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. I appreciated her direct approach as she listened to my situation without judgment. "So you want to disentangle your finances from your son's and reclaim property that is legally yours, but in his possession," she summarized after I had explained the Christmas Eve incident and shown her my inventory. "Yes, I don't want to punish him, but I need to protect myself going forward." She nodded, reviewing my documents with practiced efficiency. "Most of this is straightforward. The joint account can be closed or converted to an individual account in your name only. The life insurance beneficiary can be changed immediately. The college funds are trickier if they're in your grandchildren's names, but we can look at options." "What about the property and heirlooms?" I asked. "The undeveloped land is clearly yours if it's in your name. We'll need documentation of the loan for the vacation property if you want to reclaim that money. As for the heirlooms and furniture, do you have any documentation of the loans or gifts?" I produced a file containing photos of each item with handwritten notes on the back, indicating they were loans, not gifts. I had always been organized, a trait that now served me well. Janet seemed impressed by my thoroughness. "This is excellent. We can draft formal letters requesting the return of these items. If they refuse, we have options for recovery, though I always recommend trying the simplest approach first." By the end of our 2-hour consultation, we had developed a comprehensive plan with a timeline for each action. Janet prepared the necessary paperwork for immediate changes like the bank account and insurance policy, which I signed before leaving her office. The more complex matters would require additional documentation and time. "Ms. Reynolds, if I may," Janet said as our meeting concluded. "I see cases like yours more often than you might think. Adult children who take advantage of generous parents, especially mothers. You're doing the right thing by establishing boundaries even at this stage." Her validation strengthened my resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about self-respect and appropriate boundaries that should have been established years ago. The bank was my next stop. The process of removing Thomas from our joint account was surprisingly simple, requiring only my signature as the primary account holder. I opened a new individual account and transferred all funds except for a nominal amount to keep the old account open until any outstanding checks cleared. The bank manager, who knew me from years of transactions, processed everything without question, though I saw curiosity in her eyes at this sudden change after so many years. The insurance company required a phone call and written confirmation for the beneficiary change. I designated a local children's hospital as the new beneficiary, a decision that brought unexpected peace. The thought of my modest policy someday helping children who needed medical care seemed fitting for a retired nurse. Back home, I began the process of documenting everything in my cabin, taking photos of my current living conditions, the aging roof, the unreliable heating system, all evidence of needs I had postponed addressing while supporting Thomas. These would serve as justification for reclaiming resources if questions arose later. I also spent time researching therapists in my area who specialized in family estrangement. The emotional aspects of my decision would require as much attention as the legal and financial ones. I found a support group for parents estranged from adult children that met weekly at a community center 30 minutes away. Their next meeting was scheduled for January 2nd, and I marked it on my calendar, committing to attend. New Year's Eve arrived with no contact from Thomas or his family. A week had passed since the incident, and their silence spoke volumes about the relationship we now had. I spent the evening writing letters, not to be sent, but for my own clarity. One to Thomas, explaining my feelings about Christmas Eve and the years leading up to it. One to Emma and Jack, expressing my love and hopes that someday they might know me better. One to Amanda, acknowledging the competition she seemed to feel existed between us, though I had never seen our relationship that way. The writing was cathartic, allowing me to express emotions I had suppressed for years. When midnight arrived, I performed a small ritual of my own creation. I placed the letters in a decorative box, symbolically setting aside these unexpressed thoughts, and lit a single candle representing the new path I was creating for myself. It wasn't dramatic or elaborate, just a quiet acknowledgement that life was changing by my choice, rather than by circumstances beyond my control. On New Year's Day, the formal letters Janet had prepared were delivered to Thomas's home by certified mail, requiring a signature for receipt. These included notices about the financial changes already made and formal requests for the return of heirlooms and furniture, with specific dates by which each item should be returned. The tone was professional rather than accusatory, but the message was clear: I was reclaiming what was mine. The loan for the vacation property was addressed with a separate letter outlining repayment options, or alternatively, the transfer of part ownership equivalent to my contribution. I had no desire to create financial hardship for Thomas's family, only to ensure that my own financial security was prioritized appropriately. A final letter addressed the undeveloped land adjacent to their home. As the legal owner, I was informing them of my intention to sell it, giving them first option to purchase it at market value before listing it publicly. This land had been intended as a future gift to expand their property, but now it represented a significant asset that could improve my own living situation. The days following these notifications were quiet. I focused on practical matters in my cabin, organizing spaces that had been neglected, donating items I no longer needed, creating a home that reflected my current self, rather than preserving it as a museum to Thomas's childhood. I began making plans for home improvements that would be possible once my financial resources were fully redirected to my own needs. I also reconnected with old friends who had fallen by the wayside, as I focused on trying to maintain a relationship with Thomas's family. Lunch with former nursing colleagues, coffee with a neighbor who had always been kind, even joining a book club at the local library. These small social connections reminded me that I was not defined solely by my role as Thomas's mother. 6 days after the certified letters were delivered, my phone began ringing with calls from Thomas. I let them go to voicemail, listening to increasingly urgent messages, asking me to call him back, citing confusion about the letters he had received. Amanda called too, her voice tight with controlled anger, as she demanded an explanation for my sudden hostility toward their family. I didn't respond immediately, giving myself time to process their reactions and consult with Janet about next steps. We agreed that any communication should be in writing for documentation purposes, at least until the initial emotions had settled. I sent a brief email to Thomas, indicating that the letters contained all the information needed and that I was open to discussing arrangements for returning the requested items at his convenience. His reply came quickly, a mix of confusion, defensiveness, and attempts to make me feel guilty for overreacting to a simple misunderstanding on Christmas Eve. He claimed they had thought I had left early, that no one had realized I was outside, that they would have opened the door immediately had they known. He made no mention of having seen me through the window, or of the laughter that had followed. I didn't engage with these distortions of reality. Instead, I responded with a factual email listing specific times and events, including his appearance at the window and subsequent actions. I ended with a simple statement: I am making changes to ensure my financial and emotional well-being. This is not negotiable, though I am open to discussion about arrangements that work for all parties. The next day, a Sunday morning, exactly 1 week after the Christmas Eve incident, I was enjoying a quiet breakfast when I heard the sound of multiple cars pulling into my driveway. Looking out the window, I saw Thomas's SUV along with Amanda's sedan. All four of them were getting out. Thomas looking determined, Amanda angry, the children confused. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to face the confrontation I had known would eventually come. This was the moment that would define our relationship going forward, and I was ready. The person who opened the door to their knocking would not be the same woman who had stood helplessly in the snow a week earlier. I had found my strength in the quiet dignity of self-respect, and that would guide me through whatever came next. The knocking came forcefully, echoing through my small cabin, with an urgency that matched the expressions I had glimpsed through the window. I took my time responding, finishing my tea, and setting down the book I had been reading. This was my home, my sanctuary, and I would not be rushed or flustered by their unexpected arrival. When I finally opened the door, the contrast with Christmas Eve could not have been more striking. Now I was the one standing inside, warm and secure, while they waited on the snowy doorstep, seeking entrance. Thomas stood at the front, hand raised to knock again, with Amanda slightly behind him, her arms crossed defensively. Emma and Jack huddled together at the bottom of the steps, looking uncomfortable in the cold. "Mom," Thomas began immediately, his tone a mixture of confusion and indignation. "What is going on? These letters, the account changes, the property notices. This isn't like you at all." I regarded him calmly, noting the genuine bewilderment in his expression. In his mind, our relationship had been perfectly acceptable, my continued sacrifices expected and unremarkable. That he could see my actions as a personality change rather than a reasonable response to years of imbalance spoke volumes. "Would you like to come in? It's too cold to have this conversation on the porch," I said, stepping back to allow them entry. They filed in, bringing with them the scent of expensive perfume and the restless energy of people unaccustomed to having their expectations challenged. Amanda immediately began examining my living space with thinly veiled judgment, her eyes lingering on the worn furniture and simple decorations. The children stood awkwardly by the door, clearly uncertain why they had been brought along for what promised to be an adult confrontation. "Emma, Jack, there are some books and puzzles in the spare room if you'd like to entertain yourselves while we talk," I suggested, wanting to spare them the tension. They looked to their parents for permission, and after Amanda's curt nod, disappeared down the hallway, seeming relieved to escape. I gestured to my small living room. "Please sit down. Would anyone like tea?" "We didn't come for tea, Mom," Thomas said, remaining standing, though Amanda perched tensely on the edge of my sofa. "We came to understand why you're suddenly acting like this. The letters from the lawyer, the demands for family heirlooms, the loan repayment for the lake house. What's gotten into you?" I took a seat in my rocking chair, the same one I had nursed Thomas in as an infant, and met his gaze directly. "Nothing has gotten into me, Thomas. I'm simply making changes that reflect the current reality of our relationship." "What does that mean? Because of one misunderstanding on Christmas Eve, you're punishing us financially? That seems extreme and frankly vindictive." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," I replied calmly. "You saw me standing in the snow. You turned away. You laughed with your guests at my expense. That was a choice, Thomas, not a misunderstanding." His face flushed, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he shifted tactics. "Okay, yes, I saw you outside. I thought you were just getting something from your car and would come right back in. It was a mistake, and I'm sorry if you felt ignored. But does one mistake justify all this?" He gestured vaguely toward the hall table where I had placed copies of the legal notices. "Christmas Eve wasn't the reason for these changes, Thomas. It was simply the moment that made me see clearly what our relationship has become over many years. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice measured. When was the last time you called just to talk, not because you needed something? When did you last ask about my life, my health, my happiness? When have you shown me the basic respect you'd give to any human being, let alone your mother? Amanda interjected before Thomas could respond. This is emotional manipulation, Celeste. You're trying to make Thomas feel guilty because we have our own lives. We've been very generous allowing you to be part of our family, despite your differences in values and lifestyle. Her condescension stoked a flash of anger that I carefully contained. Generous, interesting choice of words, Amanda, considering I've been contributing to your household expenses for years without acknowledgement. The landscaping service alone costs more monthly than my medication. Thomas looked genuinely surprised. What landscaping service? We pay for that ourselves. No, you don't. I've been paying it since you moved in. It was meant to be a housewarming gift for the first year, but when you never mentioned its expiration, I continued it. That's just one example of support I've provided that you weren't even aware of. A moment of uncomfortable silence followed as Thomas processed this information. Amanda's expression shifted from righteous indignation to calculation, likely reassessing how my financial withdrawals might impact their lifestyle. So this is about money, she said finally. You're angry we didn't appreciate your financial contributions enough, so you're taking everything back. This isn't about money, Amanda. It's about respect, reciprocity, and recognizing that I matter as a person, not just as a resource. I turned back to Thomas. I've supported your dreams from the day you were born. I sold our family home to help pay for your education. I've contributed to your children's future while neglecting my own present. My roof leaks. My car is failing. I ration my medications. Yet I continued to give to you because that's what mothers do. But mothers shouldn't be treated as afterthoughts or inconveniences. Thomas had the grace to look ashamed, though Amanda remained unmoved. He sank onto the sofa beside his wife, suddenly looking less commanding than when he had arrived. What do you want from us? He asked quietly. I don't want anything except what I've outlined in those letters. The return of family heirlooms that were meant to be loans, not gifts. Repayment of actual loans that were never intended to be gifts. And most importantly, I want recognition of my autonomy to make decisions about my own resources going forward. And our relationship? Thomas asked, a note of vulnerability finally breaking through his defensive posture. Are you cutting us off completely? This was the heart of the matter, the question I had spent the week preparing to answer. I took a moment, rocking gently in my chair, gathering thoughts that had clarified during my solitary days of reflection. I'm not cutting off our relationship, Thomas. I'm establishing boundaries that should have existed all along. I'm your mother, and nothing changes that. But I'm also a person deserving of basic consideration and respect. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be built on that foundation. What does that mean in practical terms? He pressed. It means visits need to be mutual, not one-sided. It means communication should be regular and meaningful, not just when it's convenient for you. It means acknowledging birthdays and holidays with more than a text message. It means never again finding humor in someone standing alone in the cold while you're warm inside. Thomas nodded slowly, the reality of what I was asking seeming to sink in. Amanda, however, was less receptive. This is ridiculous, she said sharply. You're holding your financial support hostage unless we meet your emotional demands. That's manipulation, pure and simple. I turned to her, maintaining my composure despite her accusation. No, Amanda. Manipulation would be continuing to provide financial support while privately resenting the lack of emotional connection. I'm being direct about my expectations and needs. You're free to decide if a relationship with me is worth the effort I'm describing. If not, we can maintain a cordial distance and handle the financial and property matters through our respective attorneys. This straightforward approach seemed to catch her off guard. She had expected tears, pleas, or angry outbursts that would allow her to dismiss me as irrational. My calm clarity offered no such opportunity. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking more like the thoughtful boy I remembered than the distant man he had become. Mom, I need time to process all of this. The financial changes, the property issues, the way you're characterizing our relationship, it's a lot to take in. Of course, I agreed. Take whatever time you need. The legal matters have their own timeline as outlined in the letters, but our personal relationship isn't bound by those constraints. He nodded, then asked hesitantly, "What about Emma and Jack? They're innocent in all this." "Yes, they are," I said softly. "And I would welcome a relationship with my grandchildren that isn't filtered through layers of obligation and resentment. They deserve to know the truth of who I am, not whatever narrative has been constructed to explain my limited role in their lives." This comment clearly struck a nerve with both parents, suggesting the children had indeed been given some explanation for my absence that painted me in an unflattering light. Before either could respond, Emma and Jack reappeared in the doorway, apparently having grown bored with the books and puzzles. "Can we go now?" Emma asked, directing the question to her father, rather than making eye contact with me. "It's really small in here and it smells weird." "Emma," Thomas admonished, but the damage was done. The casual cruelty reminded me so much of the Christmas Eve incident that I had to take a deep breath to maintain my composure. I stood up, signaling that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "You're welcome to leave whenever you're ready. I've said what I needed to say." Thomas rose as well, looking torn between apologizing for his daughter's rudeness and continuing to argue his case. Amanda was already gathering her purse and coat, clearly eager to depart. Jack lingered by a shelf where I kept some of the rocks and feathers Thomas and I had collected on our nature walks years ago. "Did my dad really find these with you?" he asked quietly while his parents were distracted. I moved to stand beside him, careful not to crowd his space. "Yes, we used to take walks in the woods behind our old house. Your father was quite the nature detective, always finding the most interesting specimens." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "He never takes us on walks like that." "Perhaps you could ask him to. Sometimes parents need reminding of the things that used to bring them joy." He considered this, then looked up at me with curiosity, rather than the indifference he had shown at Christmas. "Would you come too if we did?" The simple question contained more genuine connection than I had experienced from anyone in Thomas's family in years. "I would like that very much, Jack, if I'm invited." Thomas approached, then having overheard our exchange. Something in his expression had softened, perhaps triggered by this glimpse of connection between his son and his mother, or perhaps by the reminder of the simple pleasures we had once shared. "We should go," he said, but without the defensiveness that had characterized most of our conversation. "Mom, I'll call you next week. We can talk more about everything then." I nodded, not making demands or expressing skepticism about whether the call would actually come. The ball was in his court now, and pushing would only reinforce the dysfunctional patterns we had established. They filed out much as they had entered, Thomas leading Amanda close behind, the children following. But at the last moment, Thomas turned back, meeting my eyes directly for what felt like the first time in years. "I'm sorry about Christmas Eve," he said simply. "It was wrong, and it won't happen again." It wasn't a comprehensive apology addressing the years of neglect, but it was an acknowledgement of the specific pain that had catalyzed these changes. It was a beginning, however small. "Thank you," I replied, accepting the apology for what it was not demanding more in the moment. As I watched them drive away, I felt neither triumphant nor defeated. Instead, I experienced a quiet certainty that regardless of how Thomas and his family chose to respond to my boundaries, I had taken the necessary steps to ensure my own dignity and well-being. The path forward would be determined by choices we all made from this point on, but I would no longer be standing alone in the snow, waiting for someone else to decide I was worth the effort of opening the door. The weeks following that confrontation at my cabin door were a period of adjustment and introspection for all of us. Thomas did call the following week as promised, and our conversation, while sometimes awkward, felt more honest than any we had shared in years. He asked questions about the financial support I had been providing, expressing genuine surprise at the extent of it and embarrassment at having taken it for granted. "I never realized how much you were sacrificing for us," he admitted. The way you lived so simply, I just assumed it was your preference, not because you were sending so much our way. It was partly preference, I acknowledged. I don't need a large house or luxury cars to be content. But yes, there were choices made to prioritize your family's comfort over my own. We established a weekly phone call Sunday evenings when the children were settling down for the night and could speak with me briefly before bed. The first few conversations were stiff with Emma, particularly resistant to engaging. Jack, however, seemed to have developed a genuine curiosity about me after our brief exchange at the cabin. The legal matters proceeded as outlined in Janet's letters. Thomas arranged for the return of the family heirlooms, delivering them himself rather than sending a service. As he carefully placed my grandmother's jewelry box on my kitchen table, he paused to examine the intricate carving on its lid. "I remember this in your bedroom when I was little," he said. "You used to let me look at the costume pieces, but never the real ones. You were fascinated by the colors," I recalled. "You would arrange them in rainbow order on my bedspread." These small moments of shared memory began to rebuild connections that had been severed by years of neglect. Thomas agreed to repay the loan for the vacation property in monthly installments, an arrangement that respected both his financial constraints and my need for the funds. The undeveloped land adjacent to their home was a more complicated matter. After several discussions, we agreed that I would retain ownership for the time being, rather than selling it immediately, with the understanding that they would have first right of purchase when they were financially able. Amanda remained distant, participating minimally in the phone calls, and finding reasons to be absent when I visited their home, which now happened monthly, rather than on the rare occasions when I had previously been invited. Her resistance was understandable if disappointing. The recalibration of our family dynamic meant a reduction in her control over Thomas's relationships and resources, a change she clearly found threatening. Emma gradually thawed, especially after I began sharing stories about her father's childhood that presented a different picture than the one she had known. The rebellious teenager, who had once stood in the snow outside his family home, realized she might have more in common with her grandmother than she had imagined. During my third visit, she asked if I would teach her to knit, remembering the handmade scarves and hats I had sent over the years that she had previously dismissed as old-fashioned. Jack and I developed our own special connection, centered around the nature walks I had once enjoyed with his father. Thomas began joining us occasionally, rediscovering an interest that had been buried beneath years of career ambition and social climbing. Watching my son identify bird calls for his own son, passing along knowledge I had once shared with him, became one of my greatest joys in this new chapter of our relationship. The therapy sessions I had begun in January provided essential support during this transitional period. My therapist, Dr. Winters, helped me navigate the complex emotions of rebuilding a relationship while maintaining boundaries. She emphasized that forgiveness didn't require forgetting or pretending the hurt had never occurred. "You're creating a new relationship with your son," she explained during one session. "It's informed by your shared history, but not defined by it. The past matters, but how you both choose to move forward matters more." I also continued attending the support group for parents estranged from adult children, though my situation had evolved beyond estrangement to cautious reconciliation. I found I could offer perspective to those earlier in their journey, while also learning from those who had successfully navigated the rebuilding of family bonds after difficult breaches. By spring, the practical changes I had implemented began to visibly improve my own quality of life. The cabin received its badly needed new roof, my unreliable car was replaced with a safer, more efficient model, and I no longer needed to ration my medications. These external improvements reflected the internal shift in how I valued my own needs relative to others. Thomas noticed these changes during his visits, commenting on how much more comfortable and secure my home felt. "You shouldn't have had to wait so long for these basic things," he said once, a simple acknowledgement that carried significant weight. Easter brought an invitation to their home for dinner, a genuine inclusion, rather than the obligatory gesture Christmas Eve had been. The difference was palpable from the moment I arrived. Thomas greeted me at the door with a warm hug, taking the modest dessert I had brought and placing it prominently on the dining room table. Emma had set a place for me between herself and Jack, decorating my napkin with a handmade nameplate featuring pressed flowers from our recent nature walk. Amanda was civil, if not warm, making efforts that seemed genuine, if somewhat strained. During a quiet moment while the children were hunting for Easter eggs in the garden, she approached me with an attempt at reconciliation. "I know I haven't made things easy." She began, her usual confidence somewhat diminished. "Part of me felt threatened by your history with Thomas, the years you had with him, that I could never share. It was easier to keep you at a distance than to integrate you into our family in a meaningful way." "Thank you for saying that," I replied, appreciating her honesty, even if it wasn't quite an apology. "We all protect what we value. For you, it's your immediate family unit. For me, it's always been Thomas, and now by extension, your children too. I'm trying to see that your presence in their lives doesn't diminish my role," she admitted. "It's a process. For all of us." I agreed, leaving space for the relationship to continue evolving at its own pace. Summer brought an unexpected development when Thomas called to discuss the upcoming vacation season. The property in Maine that I had helped finance had become a financial burden they were struggling to maintain alongside their primary residence. "We've been thinking about selling it," he explained. "But before we make any decisions, we wanted to discuss options with you, given your investment in the property." This consultation, simple as it was, represented a significant shift in our dynamic. My input was being sought before decisions were made, my financial contribution acknowledged as giving me a rightful place at the table. "What if we considered an alternative arrangement?" I suggested. "The cabin could become a shared family resource with scheduled times for each of us to use it and shared responsibility for its upkeep." The idea took root, eventually blossoming into a new family tradition. The vacation property became neutral ground where we could all spend time together without the baggage associated with either their home or mine. Emma and Jack particularly enjoyed these gatherings, free from the underlying tensions that sometimes still surfaced in other settings. As the one-year anniversary of the Christmas Eve incident approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed through the simple act of standing up for my own dignity. The relationship with my son had been transformed from one of unconscious exploitation to conscious appreciation. My grandchildren were developing their own direct connections with me, unfiltered through their parents' perspectives. Even Amanda and I had reached a tentative understanding based on mutual respect, if not deep affection. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of self-worth. The woman who had stood alone in the snow, knocking on a door that wouldn't open, had found the courage to open new doors for herself. The path hadn't always been smooth, and there had been painful moments of confrontation and uncomfortable truths. But the journey had led to a place of authentic relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation or habit. The Christmas Eve incident, painful as it was, had ultimately been a gift, forcing me to recognize patterns that had developed so gradually I hadn't seen them clearly. Sometimes we need to stand alone in the cold to appreciate our own strength and the warmth we deserve from those who claim to love us. As I prepared for the holidays this year, there was no anxiety about where I would spend Christmas Eve or whether my presence would be welcome. Thomas and Amanda had already invited me to join them with specific mention of a place at the main table and a room prepared for me to spend the night. Emma was excited to help me bake cookies using Robert's old recipes, and Jack had asked if we could continue our tradition of naming each gingerbread person before eating it. The cabin feels different now, filled with the genuine mementos of a life well lived rather than relics of a relationship that existed more in memory than reality. The photos of Thomas and his family are current, reflecting our present connection, rather than a past I was desperately trying to preserve. New pictures have been added too, of friends from my support group, fellow volunteers at the Children's Hospital, where I now spend time weekly, and neighbors who have become part of my expanded social circle. I've learned that family bonds are precious, but not at the expense of personal dignity. Love without respect isn't really love at all, just habit or obligation, dressed in familiar clothing. True love makes room for boundaries, acknowledges wrongdoing, and works to rebuild trust when it's been broken. If you're standing in the snow right now, knocking on a door that won't open, know that you have the strength to walk away and create warmth in your own space. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's an act of self-respect that ultimately creates the possibility for healthier relationships. Sometimes taking everything back is the first step toward receiving something genuine in return. Have you ever had to establish difficult boundaries with loved ones? How did it change your relationship? Share your experiences in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if this story resonated with you. Your journey matters, and your dignity is non-negotiable. Thank you for walking this path with me today, and may you find the courage to demand the respect you deserve in every relationship that matters to you.